Hello and welcome back to Teetotaling Timelords. If you watched my last video, you remember that I said I was reading Dune Messiah. Well, I just finished reading Dune Messiah, and so I decided I would upload a review giving my thoughts on Dune Messiah. In my preparations to read the Dune series, I looked around on the internet to see what people thought were the good books, the standout books, and just the really bad books. People generally said that the first one was really good, and that the fourth one was also really good. Then a lot of people were saying that 3 was pretty good, but that Dune Messiah, number 2, was the worst. They would say that Dune Messiah was just kind of slow and unnecessary, and that nothing really happens. And I can't necessarily blame them for thinking that, and in some respects I really agree. However, I strongly disagree in that I did not find this book boring at all. I found it actually very exciting and very tense in many points. If you're unfamiliar with the story of Dune, I highly recommend you check out Thug Note's summary and analysis of the book. Dune Messiah picks up 12 years after the original Dune book, and Paul has continued to rule the universe as the Emperor, and a religion has come up around him, and he's worshipped pretty much as a god. His powers of prescience have greatly expanded. He's very powerful, can see very well into the future, but cannot see his own downfall, which is coming right at him. The book details a conspiracy amongst a whole bunch of people who are trying to overthrow Paul as the Emperor for no real unified reason other than they just don't want him there. So I'm not entirely sure what they're trying to do. Just kind of do it. The main baddie, whose name I'm not going to try to say because I'll probably mess it up, he pales in comparison to the baddie in Dune, Baron Harkonnen, who is just an amazing and well-rounded villain, whereas in this one he's very mysterious and not in the good way. We know nothing about him, and I don't think he's a super great villain. They have this plan to give Paul, this friend from back in the day, Duncan Idaho, who is a swordsman in the employ of the Atreides family. And they managed to recover his flesh after he died in Dune, which is already kind of... I don't feel like that's likely to have happened. And then they bring him back to life, but through that process of bringing him back to life, he can't remember the past. And so you have the body of Duncan Idaho, but you don't have the actual personality of Duncan Idaho. So when you're reading it, it's not Duncan Idaho, because books don't give you a picture, necessarily. So I can't be like, oh yes, that's the same actor that played Duncan Idaho in the first one. So I know it's Duncan Idaho, but he's just acting weird. No, in books, it's all about how the character is portrayed. And it's not Duncan Idaho. So for the whole book, the entire point of him being there and that whole connection you're supposed to have with this Duncan Idaho character is not there until Duncan Idaho comes back later as actual Duncan Idaho through Dune magic. Another issue I have with this book is that they keep coming up with these Fremen traditions and things that are never mentioned before, and I would be more okay with it if that were little things. But it's every 4 pages they're coming up with some new tradition that doesn't always make sense. One of them is even a huge plot point that blind Fremen are to be thrown out into the desert to die because they're of no use to the tribe anymore, blind. And big shock, Paul ends up going blind at some point in the story. So the death of Paul Atreides, the Emperor of the universe, it has to go walk out into the desert and die. It's actually a very poetic death for Paul, but it's just this tradition that's just thrown in at the midway point of the book for seemingly no reason, and it's not mentioned in the previous book, and I would be surprised if it shows up in later books. And there's even points where Paul is no, You guys can get fake eyes. You don't have to go out into the desert. So he could have gotten new eyes and not died. He would have defeated the conspiracy that the whole book is about by not having died. It's a dumb tradition that got made up in the middle of this book. Another dumb thing is when they mention Hitler. At one point, Paul is interested in learning some old Earth history, and they bring up people like Genghis Khan and Hitler, and how they killed many, many people. This, however, pales in comparison to the number of people that have been killed in Paul's jihad, which is somewhere in the range of 60 billion. But Paul still has this sort of appreciation for people who could kill 4 million or 6 million people with such primitive means. There's also a dwarf in this book, which I found his characterization to be kind of offensive. For all the problems that I've found in the book, they're really quite minor, despite them taking most of the time in this video. I actually found the pacing of the book quite good. I found the story intriguing. The characters were generally well written. It's a whole lot shorter than the first one. It also brings up some interesting themes. Throughout the book, there's this kind of theme of vision throughout it. Paul and Alia see visions the whole time, and Paul ends up losing his vision and uses his prescient visions to inform his present. And they can't see what's coming at them, but they can see the future. And it ends up being that the future that Paul saw is not the future that ends up happening. And this causes him to permanently lose his sight. And so I think it's really interesting to see this almost a god be brought down just because he has two children instead of one. As with any books that have time travel elements in them, it's very interesting to see how it's dealt with. In Dune, seeing the future is so incredibly complex that they don't really even try to describe it. They just say that if you have never seen the future, that you can't understand it. That there's so many different timelines. And I like that they say that there's these timelines, that it's not this strict progression that must be followed. Something else brought up in this book is fatalism. Because since they can see the future, you would think that they would know how everything's going to happen, that everything has to happen a certain way. And most of the time in this book, that's exactly how it is. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Paul is able to live in the present by remembering his future visions, which he's having concurrently with what's going on. He can see in perfect detail, as if he had eyes, but he's using his mind to see what's going on. It is really, really awesome how he does it, and it's one of the highlights of the book. However, it's proven that there is a sort of free will or chaos in the universe, that not everything is going to fall into these small little boxes, in that Paul gets it wrong in the end. Chani dies and has two children instead of just the one that he thought that she was going to have, and this completely messes him up. And it's kind of ironic that the birth of two people is what ends up killing Paul. The life brings death. So in review, Dune Messiah, pretty alright. Some stupid stuff in there, but some very interesting themes, and really not as bad as some people would like it to make out. Thank you for sticking with me through this very long video about a book that you may or may not care about. Please subscribe, like this video, and comment down below. You could also show it to some friends and stuff. I promise in our next video that we will do Doctor Who. However, in response to this special video, I challenge Jerome to watch the Dune movie and make a react video. He knows nothing about Dune, so this should be very, very interesting.